Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our much anticipated panel discussion for Pride Month, focusing on body image issues and eating disorders within the LGBTQIA+ community. This event is brought to you by Bodywise, the Eating Disorders Association of Ireland, in collaboration with Gay Community News, who will be streaming the event on their YouTube channel. A recording of the discussion will also be available after the event. So we're delighted to have a diverse and well-informed panel to offer their unique insights and perspectives for the next 90 minutes. And throughout, you can submit your questions and comments through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. If you'd like to see the captions, this can also be enabled at the bottom of your screen. If you're tweeting, you can use the hashtag InPride2022 and make sure you tag us at Bodywise. Now, without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce you to our chair, Jerry Butcher, who will be launching the event and facilitating the discussion this afternoon. Over to you, Jerry.
Great, thanks very much, Ellen. I am honoured and delighted to be asked to participate in this event, and want to welcome James, Dara, Daniel, Caitlin, and Bella. It's just wonderful to have you all here this afternoon. Looking forward to an interesting discussion. Maybe I could start just by asking, do each of you want to briefly introduce yourselves, and let's take it from there? Whoever wants to kick off.
I'll go.
Bella. Yeah, go ahead, Bella.
Thanks so much, and thank you to Bodywise. My name's Bella Fitzpatrick. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the executive director at IGLIO, which is the International LGBT Youth and Student Organization. I recently just moved to Brussels for this role. Previously to that, I ran Shout Out in Ireland, so doing LGBT workshops in schools. What else? I like cake. I really like cake.
Good start.
Yeah, so that's me. Thanks for having me.
Okay, all right. Who wants to go next? James?
I'll jump in next.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, and thanks for coming on. My name is James O'Hagan. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the LGBT Champions Program Coordinator in LGBT Ireland. So I manage the work LGBT Ireland does in relation to older members of the LGBTQ community. And I suppose as in my more outside of work life, I'm a podcaster, and a lot of the conversations I've facilitated in that have been around kind of understanding the needs and experiences of more marginalized people within the queer community. I'm also a fat man and have experienced the realities of being a fat person in our society over since last week, 40 years of my time on this planet. And I suppose in the last year or two have really started to understand the nuances of what that actually means, and sort of want to try and break down some of the barriers that maybe exist for other fat people.
Great. Okay, thanks, James. And Dara.
Hi, my name is Dara. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the education officer at TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, where I'm joining you from today. So very happy to be here. Thank you to Bodywise for hosting. Apologies in advance if there's background noise. We're unpacking our Pride mess in the office today, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me okay. Yeah, and so I'm really happy to be joining you from TENI. I've been here for just over 6 months, so it's still quite new for me to be working, I suppose, professionally within sort of trans advocacy and trans education kind of spaces, but I do a lot of work with sort of trans community groups and activism and all that kind of thing in my personal life and my spare time. So I suppose I'm coming to this with a very maybe sort of specific viewpoint around, you know, body image and stuff within the trans community, and particularly within my own personal perspective around non-binary experiences. So yeah, I'm glad to be bringing that perspective.
Great, thanks, Dara. And Daniel?
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me here. I'm Daniel. I'm originally from County Mayo and I live up here in Dublin. So in November, I was in a documentary that was on RTE, which focused on male sufferers of eating disorders. And since then, I suppose everything, my kind of advocacy hat has kind of snowballed from there. So as a gay man, it's exceptionally important to me now to, I suppose, use my voice to highlight the disproportionate impact which eating disorders and body image issues have on people within the LGBT community. And hopefully, with the aim of, attempting to, I suppose, prevent, the how debilitating the illness is for some people within the community who may be struggling with their identity or struggling with their sexuality. So that's something that I'm exceptionally passionate about doing now, and I do a lot of giving out on Twitter, but it's important.
Okay, Daniel, thank you. And finally, Caitlin.
Hello, my name is Caitlin. I'm from Belfast, East Belfast, and that's again where I'm joining you from today. I'm a writer primarily, so I write stuff across theatre, screen, radio, and a lot of the stuff I like to write about is about kind of the intersections between queerness, fatness, and disability as a fat, queer, disabled person. So writing a lot from my own experience, and I'm delighted to be here.
Great, thanks very much. I just realized in introducing myself, I didn't say who I am or what I do. I work as a psychotherapist and have been working in this field around eating disorders for the last 30 odd years. And so have a great interest in the whole area of eating disorders. And I'm just delighted that we can bring something fresh, maybe and new to say to those in the eating disorders community as well. Maybe can I start by asking you guys, maybe just to jump straight in, what does pride mean to you?
I'll jump in first.
James, yeah.
So after I was like, I've got to make sure you don't jump in first on the first question. But no, so I was thinking a bit about, because obviously this question was, we got to have a look at what they were going to be talking, or what we were going to be talking about, and I was thinking a lot about this, sort of what I was going to say last week, and then Pride weekend actually happened, and I had the privilege of walking with the LGBT Ireland group in the parade, and the LGBT Ireland group was primarily made up of members of our peer support groups, specifically around from refugees, asylum seekers, people living in seeking international protection here from direct provision, people from Ukraine and Afghanistan. And I suppose the absolute joy that was being experienced by those people able to safely express their identity was something that just absolutely overwhelmed me. We've moved on here in Ireland to be able to start having maybe a more nuanced conversation about what pride means and what pride needs to look like and what inclusion for LGBTQ people it needs to look like. And that's a really great and important place to be. But I just think for me, in that moment, walking in the parade alongside so many people who are coming up to me and saying, I literally wouldn't be able to be on the street. I wouldn't be able to tell anyone my identity, sort of where I have come from. And I think it highlighted the importance of how far we've come and how we need to accept and create an environment that respects refugees and asylum seekers who've come here to find that safety and the beauty and vibrancy and color that those people bring to our country. So I think that for me, after the weekend, is what's resonated with me post this Pride.
Can I pick up on that if I could, and maybe others might want to come in on that sense of safety that you talk about? I suppose in my own experience of working with and talking to people from the LGBTIQ plus community, often my sense is that somehow is lacking for them, that sense of personal safety. Does anyone want to come in on that?
I'll just quickly say, I think every single person sitting here in this call has a very finely attuned spidey sense for when you're in a space that is not welcoming of you. And then I'll let someone else talk.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
I think what I might mention on that, on the safety piece, and I think it's relevant when we're discussing, Pride, the event, is also to kind of highlight the different, to bring in intersectionality already, the buzzword or whatever, but to highlight that different people have different kind of areas in which they might be more or less safe, and different kinds of parts of their lives or who they are, whatever, that might make them more or less safe at, in any given day, in any given moment, and particularly at events like Pride. And I think we see that when we are working with, and as you said, around refugees or people kind of with kind of different like legal statuses in Ireland, and particularly also around people who might be homeless or kind of experiencing housing precarity, poverty, and then also obviously people from racialized communities as well. So I think it's really important when we talk about safety to also recognize that it looks different for everybody.
Yeah.
I suppose it would be remiss not to mention obviously trans people within that too, of
Yes.
course. But I think it's important to note that what makes things safe for some people doesn't make them safe for other people as well. And particularly when we're speaking about pride and about trying to create a space in a community that is safe and welcoming for everybody, and not just for almost the majority within our minority community too.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dara. Anyone else want to come in on that? Okay, we
I
can.
will.
Sorry, yeah, Bella. Yeah, please. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You might have to pull names specifically.
Okay. I'll do that then. Okay, guys, I will. Yes, I'm making
But
notes, and I will be asking questions. Okay.
I would like to say that, I think what my friends and colleagues have said is so important around, the feeling that you can celebrate in that day. And it's really cathartic. I think Pride is very cathartic. It's like a moment to kind of celebrate how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. But like this moment to just take stock, especially if you're working in the area, it's hard. And particularly now, it's really, really difficult. I think we saw at the weekend, there was a shooting in Oslo at a gay bar, and at Turkey, they tried to march in Pride and they were brutally attacked. And I think when we think about safety, we need to remember that when there is safety in numbers, and that's what's so nice about Pride, is like when we're all together. And that's why you see people expressing themselves in the way that they can't on a daily basis, like a different type of maybe gender expression or something like that, which is really fabulous. And that's why it's always important to remember, like, when you have a Pride where you are safe as a group, because there's so many of you, besides like obviously internal discrimination, which obviously happens, but the presence of, say, police or Gardaí at that point is to protect the other people. Like, we're safe in our group, so it's to protect the others. And I think it's always worth remembering, like, if police are there, is it for our protection? Because I don't think it is. Not in Ireland, and maybe in other places. I can't speak to other places, but not in Ireland. So yeah. Not ideal.
Okay. So guys, can I just let's jump straight into part of the reason we're here today. We want to talk about body image, and I suppose specifically what is unique in your experience for people in your community around body image and eating disorders. And I'd particularly like to try and flesh out what, if excuse the pun or the phrase, no pun intended. What is the what are the standout issues compared? Are there differences for you compared to anybody else who might have an eating disorder? So I don't. Anyone want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll
Daniel.
Let's kick us off. So I think that within the community, because obviously when you're growing up and you're struggling with your sexuality or identity, again, it's that control element. So that's kind of why it does unfortunately lend itself somewhat to an eating disorder. And also, as a lot of the experts would say, is an eating disorder is something that's biopsychosocial. So it's a myriad of issues that I suppose perpetuate it. And definitely, I think that when you're growing up and there's a huge sense of isolation, with a lot of people in terms of coming to accept themselves and understanding themselves. And when you factor in, unfortunately, a lot of the way that society in general tends to treat queer people, we live in an exceptionally heteronormative society. Everything is geared towards heterosexual cisgendered people. It just further perpetuates that isolation. You feel further and further removed. And I think what I find the most maddening really is that a lot of people tend to kind of ignore the interrelationship between their actions and the consequences that it causes for people within the community. So, I mean, people will stand there and they will say, oh, for example, we need more eating disorder supports. But then at the same time we'll say, but we also need a balanced conversation about this particular, gender issue or anything like that, which again, like all that does is cause severe damage to people within the community. And specifically, I can't speak to the trans community because I'm not a trans person, but specifically to the trans community as well. And so that's what I find a little bit maddening, because as I said, there is that interrelationship. It's all part of the same spectrum and stuff. And then within the community as well, it does particularly, and again, like all I can speak to is as a gay man, is that there is obviously huge emphasis is put on body and put on body image. And, you know, there's kind of a particular look, and you're put into different categories on the basis of your look, and you're given a name. And, you know, and again, it just kind of pushes that notion that what seems to matter the most within the community at times is your look and your image and everything like that. And I think that that's obviously just going to further perpetuate kind of eating disorders and body image issues within the community.
Yeah, Caitlin?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there. I have two kind of thoughts, or two things kind of sprung to mind. One of them was, I was just actually thinking, like, when have I ever been publicly judged for my body, or felt like, I don't know, aware of my body? And most of the time that's been in queer spaces. The only times I've actually had vocal fat phobia directed at me was at gay clubs, either by people on stage and by other people in the clubs. So I find that quite interesting, and then I felt very unsafe in those spaces, so it was quite difficult for me. And then the other thing I kind of wanted to touch on was, as a queer femme presenting person, and as a fat person, it's been really hard for me. So I've kind of been exclusively dating women for the past few while, and kind of finding, like, where do I fit in? Because I'm bisexual, but it's going, I don't know. I had no, like, I was on the apps, and, like, basically no luck with other queer women on apps, and you can't help but internalize that and go, well, is it because I'm fat, or is it because I'm this, or is it because I'm that? What is that about? And yeah, those were a bit rambly, but those were kind of my initial thoughts on the subject that I thought I'd
all right, thanks, Caitlin. Dara, do you want to come in on that, or Bella?
Yeah, I think I'm sure we'll get into this. I think something kind of that is sort of, I think maybe coming through this sort of conversation so far is around the linking oftentimes between our body image and of course, like, beauty standards and ideals, and how much that is gendered as well. And I think that comes up a lot around how we interact with each other through our sexualities, and also obviously how we interact with ourselves in terms of understanding our gender and our gender expression, and how we want to both express ourselves to the world, and also, like, interact with others in that kind of way, whether it's with strangers in the street, or people that you know, or people in the gay club, or whatever it might be. And you know, as I was thinking about this conversation before we came on the call, and even thinking about my own history, kind of with my understanding of myself and my own relationship with my body, like, so much of it is through the lens of gender, and through the lens of wanting to express myself in a way that felt good and safe for me, and correct to my understanding of myself. And then also how much of that has real material consequences in terms of how other people read you, in terms of your safety when you are out in public or interacting with gendered spaces. And unfortunately, how much of that comes down to how well you fit in with the gender norms of the day, or how well, you know, other people will kind of allow you into those spaces, which I think a lot of it comes down to, how sort of socially acceptably attractive you can be sometimes. So I think it's a minefield in many ways, I think, along many different kind of loci of different identities.
And Bella, thanks, Dara.
Yeah, I'd love to just come back on what Daniel said around, like, being LGBT and having some part of you that requires a coming out of some sort, because we're not the presumed norm. So you have to have this process whereby you come out, means that you have inevitably, for the vast majority of people, had this time where you've kept quite a large secret. It's quite the breeding ground for eating disorders, that type of removal, that type of secrecy, and that internalized shame. I mean, it's no wonder that our community suffers from eating disorders more than the general population, is my understanding. And then I think also, to come back on what Dara said, it's very interesting that also I think it's great that there's a good fat representation on the panel as well. And as a fat femme, fatness is spoken about as like a kind of like anti-gender affirming substance. Like, fat men are feminized and fat women are masculinized. It's like seen as like, you're too big to be a woman, and then for men it's seen as like a feminine thing. And then, you know, and then also trans people as like, not to step on your toes, are like obviously denied medical care due to fat phobia within the medical community. So there's so many intersections going on. And when you're part of a minority group, you have this like minority stress. It's just like the low level of stress you have all of the time from being part of a minority group. And where that intersects with both having an eating disorder, being fat, being disabled, being queer, being trans, all of these things, it's like the perfect storm in many ways. And we need to talk about it more and stop having these like horrible standards in our community whereby, you know, like on the apps, I know they like literally, I mean, maybe James will speak to this, where, you know, it literally says no fats, no femmes on dating apps for men, like on Grindr and stuff. And God, we have to stop doing that to ourselves and to each other. It's gross.
And so I mean, James, yeah, please come in. Yeah,
I just might jump in on this, what everyone's been thinking about, and it does come back to like there are so many layers that are like landing on top of each other to create, and it's tendrils that are going off in various different directions with other results that are never really the optimal one that you want, which is a person feeling happy and content within their own body. I suppose, speaking very specifically to my own experience, I suppose I got fat as a child because I was sort of presenting in a much more effeminate way, because I am a more sort of obviously, I suppose, queer individual. So I didn't fit in with what was the expected route that the others around me would have gone with. So I got put on weight as a result of that. Then I was othered for being fat because that sort of was seen as a personal failing. So no one had noticed that I was, or there hadn't been a safety net there to notice that sort of I was obviously sort of reacting to being othered or made feel less value then because of how I was presenting myself. Then I put on weight and that was seen as a personal failing. And ultimately I realized who I was and found my identity and went to the space that I thought was going to be where I would be accepted, and walked in. And there is this sort of, I suppose, this sort of hierarchy that exists within the particularly the gay male community, and you know, it's about being sexually attractive to other people in the most conventionally way possible. And so I didn't fit into that sort of into that mold, and therefore was made entirely invisible unless I was sort of willing to be fetishized by people who would have a specific interest in me purely for my body, not because of who I was or my personality. And I think it's like a conversation like that really needs to happen, so you understand all of the layers that are happening and how much needs to be peeled back before you can kind of, I just get this, because I mean, as Bella mentioned, sort of you're not even sort of in this sort of call, we're not even necessarily talking about the barriers that exist to fat people outside of the LGBTQ community. And oftentimes I find frustratingly is that because there is such a primacy put on the very specific pinnacle of kind of, you know, Chris Hemsworthishness in the gay community, you sort of individuals who have perfectly average bodies start using the language of fatness to describe and talk about themselves because they feel othered by not fitting into this unattainable beauty standard. And that means people who are actually fat just sort of like, you become entirely invisible. You are just, you're not welcome, you're not wanted, you're not spoken about, you're pushed off to the side of photographs, you're not in the carousel of images that are put up on Instagram after Pride. And it's little things like that you do notice. And I suppose you always then come back to this size of, well, ultimately you were told by society being fat is a personal failing. You have personally failed by being fat, so you deserve the way you're being treated.
Okay, and I mean, taking that into consideration, is there a way in which, I suppose we need to look at this, and I think today maybe I would hope is a part of opening up this conversation more within the Pride community, ideas on what you think can be done, what more can be done to A, raise awareness of this issue, and B, what could be done about that? How do we challenge some of those stereotypes that you talk about?
I'm going to just jump in straight there,
Bella,
because I am like hugely passionate about schools. I love schools. Schools are the best places. And when I was working in Shout Out, we were doing LGBT inclusion workshops in schools all across on the island of Ireland, in schools. You know, sometimes you'd be in a school where it was great and, you know, really, really accepting, and you'd be in a school literally next door where it was awful, really, really terrible. And a lot of those places, the single sex schools are really tough. All boys schools particularly difficult, and you're seeing more anti-LGBT rhetoric than kind of ever before. It's
Right.
quite astonishing. My job's harder today than it was in 2014. Like that's
Really?
just, yeah, absolutely, 100%. Like before we used to go into schools and there'd just be kind of ignorance, and now there's like active anti-LGBT sentiment, particularly anti-trans sentiment, you know, coming from like an alt-right online faction. Anyway, a nightmare. But I really believe that schools are such an important place for this, because the number one reason people get bullied is due to bodies, like their bodies being different, or you know, and them being fat, or you know, or skinny or short, or you know, whatever it is. That is the number one reason. And yet we still have like fat phobic policies in schools. We still have, you know, stupid things in and around weighing kids. And then you see in the UK, like there were kids taken away from their loving parents because they were overweight. Again, speaking to what James is saying, it's a failing. It's a failing to just exist, to just be alive. And that then when you also feel like it's a failing to just be queer, like it's just, whoa, it can be so much. I think if we don't fully start being critical about how we're teaching kids to view themselves in schools and view each other, and you know, this is not all individual. I think sometimes we look at this as we need to have individual solutions to a systematic problem. You cannot confidence your way out of this. Like you cannot like take enough like selfies that you actually recover from your eating disorder. It's not going to work. It's so systematic. And the home ec, it just came out. Like I did home ec in school, loved home ec. It's like probably the only subject I'm using on a daily basis. I'm not trying to rag on home ec at all, but home ec, literally I had to write a menu for someone who was trying to like recover from obesity. I had to talk about the types of patterns and styles you might wear to be more flattering on yourself as an overweight person, such as no horizontal stripes, you know, that type of thing. That's on the leaving certificate, you know, like
that was this year. That's right. Yeah, that came up this year. Horrific.
Crazy.
I couldn't believe it.
In what is otherwise an excellent subject that could be fabulous and really valuable for lots of people to learn. So I think for me, how do we address this? Schools. But like that's going to be my answer to a lot of things.
Well, you know, some of the research will back you up on this, because I know that over quite a number of years in Norway, this has been a huge part of their work in trying to reduce eating disorders in the community, is to get into the schools. But one of the things they found is that if you're going in at second level, it's too late. You actually need to get in even earlier than second level. You need to get in coming toward the end of the primary school years, or even earlier than that, perhaps. So I certainly would back that up. But I think it would be interesting to know or see, would primary schools be open to this? Is because I think there's probably a, relatively speaking, easy enough to get into maybe some of the secondary schools, but bring this into primary schools, I think we're on another whole challenge there.
I mean, I just
James.
yeah, I would I think it's so important it starts that early, and like the optics of, say, primary school children being trucked out in Operation Transformation every year for a sort of like a run around thing. It's kind of like that is getting so ingrained. And the problem is that weight is and among everything else, it's also become a moralistic issue. People think that they can moralize to fat people, or that there needs to be a direction you need to be on a road of travel towards becoming you need to be trying to attain a sort of a different type of body to the one you have. And if you're not trying to do that, it's because you are bad or a wrong person. I think you asked a question about kind of what we could do in schools to try and do this. I do think it's about also allowing individuals have a range of activities to participate that respect the sort of things that people want to do. So I went to an all boys school where GAA was the only available thing, the only available activity that was sort of, you know, participated in a broad way after school. That wasn't that was not a good space for me to be in. There was no arts or drama program. There was no sort of other sort of cultural sort of stuff, which would be far more sort of stuff that I or a lot of queer children would find themselves into. But it is, I suppose, it's seen as much more of a kind of a nice to do, whereas sort of sports is usually, well, you have to do that because you have to be active, because you have to be you have to look this particular way. So I think that you know, the conversation probably starts with parents with the sort of the way we talk about fatness and fat people and the way we sort of prioritize or moralize about it as an issue. That's my rant for
okay, thanks.
I'll turn.
Caitlin, come in. Yes, Caitlin.
I was going to jump in about for me, in terms of how do we start to open these conversations, how do we start talking about this, for me, is like a writer that is like media, and we need to see diversity on our TVs. We need to see stories of fat people, of people living with eating disorders, of people who are living with disabilities, and we need to see those normalized, because that's going to be the way that people can empathize, that people can understand. The amount of times I've written stuff and people go, God, I've never thought of that before, because it was outside of their own lived experience. So I think it's a great, like, I think that is just a great way of kind of educating in a way where it's kind of, people don't almost realize they're being educated.
Yes.
But yeah, that's, for me, that's something I'm really passionate about, is trying to tell those stories and hopefully then open those conversations and get people to think in a different way. I did it. I wrote a play last year about medical fat phobia, and I've had so many people come forward to me afterwards going, oh my goodness, because of course if you've never experienced it, how would you ever know? It's one of those things. So yeah, that's what I think.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Dara, Daniel, do you want to come in on this? Raising awareness.
I'll speak briefly. Sorry, I don't want to. But no. So like, I also think that it's important to, like, obviously, as Bella was saying, it is entirely a systematic issue. 100%. There's no doubt about that. But I also think on an individual level, it's also important to kind of, I suppose, be cognizant of the language we're using, how we're describing people, how we're describing ourselves. You know, and also I also think that it's important, obviously, if the environment is safe and conducive to it, to actually have these conversations with people. If someone says something that is fatphobic, that is transphobic, you know, to actually say to them, what you just said there is actually not on. Why are you saying that? And to have those type of conversations, obviously, once it's entirely safe to do that. But then I also think that we also need to realize that for a lot of the queer representation in the media and queer influencers and people like that is actually the only access to queerness that a lot of young closeted people will have, because you know, it's personal. They have their phone, no one will see what they're looking at or interacting with. So I also think that it's important for those people that kind of have a massive platform within the community to be so careful of what they're saying. And I'm not saying that the entire responsibility should be put on these individual people, not at all. But also, you know, like, there's some influencers, obviously I won't name names, that would say things like, the most infuriating statement in existence, I think, is when you say, oh, he's straight skinny, but gay fat. So it's kind of like saying that, you know, someone is thin by straight standards, but then by gay standards, you're overweight or whatever like that. And it's kind of like, and really people with massive platforms saying things like that, and you know, almost kind of saying, well, that is an exceptionally damaging thing to say. So I think that from that point is also just exceptionally important, because, you know, as older gay people, I mean, people over 25. Not saying that it's not old. Sorry, I worded that very poorly. It's not old. We're not teenagers. We're not, for us, you know, ones in our mid-20s later on, you know, we kind of are almost a bit of a blueprint for queerness for a lot of people, and how we interact with each other and speak about ourselves and speak to each other is just so fundamentally important for the development of those people coming behind us, and you know, that will continue on for generations and generations.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Dara, just in the you thoughts, just in the from the trans community perspective, is there how do we facilitate more open conversation? How do we bring this more into the open to break down these stereotypes?
Small question, easy peasy. I think we need to really understand what you know, fatness and more importantly, I think fat phobia can mean for the trans community and within the trans community. I think before we are able to sort of break down stigma, break down shame, break down that kind of thing, I think we need, as a community, as a wider community, to understand kind of how this works for trans people, and what can be linked in for trans people around our sort of relationship with our bodies and with ourselves. And I think one of the things that I'm quite conscious of is always around understanding where the links are between gender dysphoria on one hand and body dysmorphia on the other hand. And I always have to double check that I'm saying those two things correctly, because I often mix them up, and they are, I think, quite often very connected, but they are also very distinct in really important ways. And I think understanding for, you know, when somebody, or particularly a trans person, is having the issues with their relationship with their body, kind of understanding where that's coming from. And I think there has been really wonderful research and really wonderful evidence on the success of like gender affirming healthcare in treating gender dysphoria, and in kind of making people, or helping people, or facilitating people to have a better relationship with their bodies and with their expression of themselves and all that kind of thing. And that is absolutely wonderful. But also understanding that maybe won't, or probably won't necessarily treat body dysmorphia, and that if you need to understand kind of where that's coming from for you. And I think on an individual level, and then also on a more widely social level, we need to, I hope for people to understand kind of that distinction is really important for the trans community in terms of how we approach treatment, how we approach, you know, opening up that conversation, and how we think about, you know, the sort of solutions that we're offering to people. And the solutions sometimes will be around medical transition, if that is something that somebody wants to engage with, but it might not always be. And I suppose for me, on a wider level, if there's something that I could, you know, click my fingers and have happen, it would be that we wouldn't have these, and I know this is blue sky thinking, but that we wouldn't have these sort of gendered associations with bodies in the way that we do, and that we wouldn't have these sort of automatic conflation between certain types of bodies and certain types of genders, and that might, I think, probably help people to have a better overall relationship for everybody, not just for trans people, with their bodies. If we weren't trying to maybe constantly, or for some trans people, feel like they need to change their body in order to better be able to express themselves, or even more importantly, in order for the rest of the world to better be able to understand you, because a lot of the time that is what it comes down to, is not necessarily so much anymore around that narrative of being sort of born in the wrong body or trapped in the wrong body so much, but about how the rest of the world is understanding you. And I think there's a really important social element in the sort of gender piece there as well, because a lot of the time gender is something, unfortunately, that other people give to you. So I think if we could break down some of that gender nonsense, that would be wonderful. And I think if we could do that in schools, that would be wonderful. And even, I suppose, in terms of commenting on the sort of wider social narratives, and particularly on the piece around schools, and on kind of how we're talking about bodies and fatness and all that kind of thing at a social level, you know, I think so much of this comes back down to the narrative and the rhetoric around sort of the so-called obesity epidemic, and how that has seeped into how we think about ourselves, how we think about each other, all of that morality piece around, you know, being fat being a moral failing, being fat being a personal responsibility, being wrong in the first place. And I think if we could break down some of that piece, that would be wonderful. And if we could break down some of the gendered associations with bodies, I think that would go a long way towards helping people.
I'm conscious, even as we're talking, that even when it comes down to some of the, you know, what we've seen in the UK, particularly recently, where, you know, calories have to appear on menus by law now. And even I was in a coffee shop recently, and I was here, and I was quite appalled to see listed up beside all of the coffees how many calories were in each one, and how much that can not so subtly influence people. So something as simple as that, even, you know, make you decide which kind of coffee are you going to have today. You know, go on, Dara.
Sorry, just to comment on that as well, because one of my absolute bugbears in the world is how flawed and made up and absolutely fake, like, most nutrition science is, and like particularly around calories. Like, it doesn't, when you get into the science, and this is all, I'm not a scientist, and I'm a disclaimer, you know, but it doesn't mean hardly anything. And like this whole thing of like X many calories a day per person, completely made up. So I think if we could, even if we could acknowledge that like the way that we think about this is flawed, and it's built on data that doesn't make sense, and it's built on data that doesn't make sense for most people, or particularly on a social level, you know, we wouldn't have things like calorie counts beside coffee drinks, because it's not a good way of measuring energy. It's not a good way for people to measure their daily intake, and it also shouldn't matter. Sorry, any chance I get to talk about that, I will talk about it.
Yeah, I would just like to come in and say I am a scientist, in that I did study science, and just to concur, it not only does it not make any sense, even if you really did think that fatness was bad. This would be a bad way to go about that, even, you know, even if that really was your goal, this would not work. It's the stupidest public policy ever, and it's robbing people of the joy of food and the joy of movement as well. Like, I have had such a traumatic time in school with PE that only when I was like 22 did I realize that exercise could be something that's enjoyable. And I know for a lot of people who are experiencing eating disorders, they either don't exercise because it increases appetite, and that's not something they can do. And apologies if this is triggering to anyone, or they over exercise to the point at which it's unhealthy. And similarly with food, like, we've just been robbed of the joy of both food and movement, both of which are like beautiful things that can like make your life fabulous every single day, you know. And I just feel really sometimes quite bitter that that has happened, not just to me but to so many people, and that it took me so long to kind of reclaim that. And it's such a massive waste of time where I could have just been enjoying myself.
So I mean, taking all that into consideration, is there a way in which we influence then at another level? You know, for example, I'm thinking especially of politicians, because if politicians, for example, as done in the UK, are going to pass a law around something like calories on menus, just to give that one example, how, and even indeed in terms of the necessity of the lack of services in that, how is that message going to be brought home to them?
I think on
Daniel?
that point, I think that it's very important to realize that, okay, if you want to put calories in the menus, if that's what you think is a great policy decision, then you have got to bolster eating disorder support services, because you can't have one and not the other. You know, there's many people out there that will go to a restaurant and see a calorie on a menu and it won't bother them in any way, shape, or form. And then there's other people that it would turn a simple, like a family outing, into an absolute nightmare situation for them. And it's just something that really, really does irritate me, because you have, you know, one messaging on this side and then messaging on that side, and you know, they're constantly butting heads, and they're just not making any sense. You know, you can't be calling for better support, you can't be promising better supports, but then at the same time implementing policies which are actually just perpetuating eating disorders and perpetuating body image issues. So I think that that's very important to stress, is that if you want to do one, then it's important that you have the supports there available to people, and also an element of understanding and compassion for other human beings. I think is so fundamentally important. I saw a lot of that at the beginning of the year when there was lots of discussions about shows like Operation Transformation and things like that, is that people, you know, saying things which so in some cases I put down to ignorance, in other cases I do put it down to malice, but saying things like, oh, well, just turn the television off, just do this, just do that. And like, you don't understand what you're talking about. Like, and everyone deserves an opinion, everything like that, but you fundamentally are totally do not know what you're talking about. It's not as simple as turning off the TV. It's not as simple as closing your eyes and avoiding the calories in the menu, you know, because it's the internal feeling that it gives you. It's the sense of panic that it gives you, you know. So I think that it's just, again, it's understanding the human condition and understanding that other people struggle with things, other people need assistance, and providing that assistance, that support, and that compassion, I think is really important.
And so I'm wondering, just to come back, I don't want to lose a sense of what we're about here today, which is about looking at the issues around body image. But I mean, someone had mentioned earlier on, I'm not sure if it was James, just that the dating apps, or maybe you mentioned Daniel, what impact do they have on people's body image? I mean, it's already been mentioned, and I know that's come up as well in a recent Australian study that's just been carried out as well, where they found that dating apps were particularly vicious, really, when it came to people's sense of themselves regarding their bodies, for the Pride community. What I don't want to talk about their own experience or suggestions around that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the being a fat person on dating apps of any type, whether I mean, and I do think that when it comes to the dating apps that are designed for gay men, you don't even have the luxury of like, you know, kind of having that kind of have to swipe to match element to it, where you're able to kind of like have that kind of, you know, the conversation is able to be started at any point. And certainly, you know, I suppose my personal experiences of being on them would be that sort of I am told constantly I don't belong there, first and foremost. And this goes through all of gay culture. I mean, I host a RuPaul's Drag Race recap podcast, and I can tell you in every single episode I will be complaining about the fact that there is this like consistent is perpetuating a word, I'm inventing it now if it isn't, of this particular beauty standard that we're all to be fawning over, the sort of, you know, the abbed Adonises march out, and all of everyone sort of like is fawning all over themselves, and you see that going out. And I think this happens throughout the entire community. As much as, say, I absolutely adore Panty Bliss, and I do adore Panty Bliss, her Instagram stories and her bar's Instagram stories are absolutely consistently just sort of her bar staff with their tops off and their six packs out, changing their t-shirts. And what that tells people is like, this is what you want to look like. This is how to be desirable. Then you have people who maybe don't quite fit that, but are slightly underneath it. And they'll be using, as I said, the language of fatness to describe themselves, because they feel bad about not being what's seen here. And when you move around then, I suppose, actually directly into the dating apps, it's first and foremost, people are extremely upfront about their preferences for particular types of person. And the language has changed now. It's become more nuanced. They don't just say, we don't want fat guys anymore. It's about, I like an active lifestyle, and you must want an active lifestyle as well. Or, you know, I like outdoorsy activities, and so should you. Or and it's about sort of these subtle messages to you. Because I am a bit of a troll on dating apps on occasion. So I go to the gym a lot. I do a lot of exercise, and I have a very active lifestyle. So I would message people and be like, hi, I have a very active lifestyle. And then they would make it clear, oh no, well, actually, that's not what I meant. I'm like, okay, so you're fat phobic then. That's what you meant. But you don't want, you wanted to, without having to own your fat phobia, you wanted to be able to skate by and just allow the fat person to understand from reading the sign on the door, you're not welcome here. And I think that's the problem. I'm not sure. I went on a little bit of a story there in my rant, but that's more or less the problem. I think it exists right the way through. It's about the sort of hierarchy within the community that perpetuates this single type of attractiveness within the gay male community, at least, and that everyone has to be trying to live up to. And if you fall into the category that can be described as fat, you are just invisible, othered, and need to put up with being told you're less than everyone else.
Other experiences of dating apps?
I'll just jump in very quickly. I don't want to oversaturate it with a gay man talking again, but no, just everything that James said, I would 100% mirror and back and everything. And I think the thing about some particular dating apps that are more so geared just towards pure intimacy rather than anything else, they tend to be quite I think transactional would be the word that I would use. So it'd be kind of like, I'm using you for this is the purpose, then it's done, then you're gone. So I think that as a consequence of that, people almost treat it as, like, for lack of a better term, like a cattle mart. And, you know, everyone's standing there and be like, want that, don't want that, don't want that. And then we're just being exceptionally impolite and rude to people unnecessarily. You know, like I know situations, and I've had it done to me too, where people I wouldn't even interact with on the app message you and just to insult you, and you're like, well, what's the entire purpose of that? You know, and again, things like, as James was saying, things like, oh, I'm fit, so I expect you to be fit too. You know, don't expect anything of anyone else. You know, you're always going to be disappointed then, you know. So I think that again, it's just they're for all, because there obviously are positive elements to apps and everything like that in terms of relationships and meeting people and things. But I just think that if you're on there entirely for intimacy, that's absolutely fine. Like, I'm all for that, but at the same time, that doesn't give you the grounds just to be a rude person to people in that time.
Yeah. Okay, Caitlin?
Just a touch, I think I said earlier about kind of feeling ignored, but it's weird because so whenever I have both kind of, you know, I hate to be so kind of binary about it, but just on the categories, it's like male, female, when I have them both kind of on one of the apps, for example, I'll find that I will get engagement from men, but it'll be to objectify me because of my body. So they're either like only engaged with me in terms of that, the aesthetic, or if it's generally someone who is femme or femme presenting, I just feel I never got any matches or ignored, which is just both ways. It's incredibly depressing, because you go, well, either I can take this and feel like an object, or I can not take this because I I'm not getting any engagement. But luckily I did actually find my girlfriend. So there is a happy ending. I did find my girlfriend on an app. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom out there. Just in case she's watching this and be like, hey, but yeah, so it is difficult, and I think it does feed back into your own self, sense of self and who you are, and as much as, you know, and I'm a very positive person about my own body image and my own fatness and you know, whatever, but it doesn't help. It does impact you when you kind of look and you've got like no matches and you go, well, what? On purely aesthetics as well. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
And I just taking all of that, you know, we're not going to change the world of apps, because they're out there, they're meeting a particular need, and sometimes there are some good stories to come out of them, often not. But I suppose, just to move on from that, I want to move into another area. Something, sorry, one of the things, there's a theme coming through here for me, which is about the sense of isolation that is often created in the both within the, shall I say, the pride community, but also outside of that, and the lack of a sense of safety is the other one. And then the third thing that's coming in is that whole area of compassion. A couple of you have mentioned that, you know, and I think particularly the need for self-compassion, because I wonder in this context, and I suppose this brings in my own work to play here, is I'm finding increasingly that the lack of self-compassion has a huge part to play in people's mental health generally. And I do think, I wonder, we were talking earlier on about what we need to bring to communities. I think one of the things is teaching people how to be self-compassionate, how to, you know, love who you are just for who you are, without feeling this incredible desire or need to have to change it. And I don't know what your own experience is of that, if I may ask you if you want to comment on that or not.
I'm happy
Bella?
to come in there. Thank you, Jerry. I think it's really, really important. I think self-compassion is kind of separate from self-love. I think you can have compassion for yourself and still be on a journey of loving yourself potentially. I think, you know, a lot of it is, for me, on my journey to like accept myself as both fat and bi, was a lot to do with how I saw other people as much as it was myself. When I started consuming media that was more diverse in terms of the types of bodies and peoples and stories, you know, as Caitlin has said about the importance of the story, I remember I went to the beach, and I remember just thinking that everyone was so beautiful. Like the old people were beautiful, that to say they were also stunning. And I wasn't even thinking about myself. So sometimes that can be really helpful, is that you just, you know, look at your what you're scrolling through, and get rid of the stuff that makes you feel bad, and add in things that make you feel good. Like I follow so many fat yoga people that I forgot that skinny people do yoga. Like I saw a skinny person doing yoga and I was like, that looks bizarre. What's happening? And I was like, oh yeah. Actually, sorry, traditionally skinny people do yoga. But for me, my times was just like fat, Black, POC, disabled people, and this really, really helps. And I think also self-compassion comes from a place of like not allowing you to have as much negative self-talk, but like that's so easier said than done. Like,
Absolutely.
and I think sometimes externalizing the voice can be really helpful. So actually saying the thing you're saying to yourself in your head out loud, or writing it down, and then being like, oh, that's mean. And then like, you know,
you wouldn't say it to a friend.
Exactly. You would not say that to your friend. And then I think also creating boundaries for yourself in terms of like, I'm a fat woman with a fat mom. There is no worse combination than a fat mom with a fat daughter. She just says all the things she has said to herself to you.
Years.
And I just am like, so now I'm just like, no, I'm not here for that. I will not hear that. If you want to make a comment about that, then that's going to jeopardize how much time I get to spend with you. And that's a boundary. And it's not about telling her what to do. It's about explaining what the consequences are going to be with me and myself. And I will not be able to spend time with you if you're going to be making comments like this. And over the years, she's learned so much. She's now like into fat liberation. She's like damn fat phobia, because she's learned from me, which is really, really amazing in so many ways. So I think self-compassion is hugely important. And I think the fact that like having that type of conversation is seen as like womanly, so there's not as much conversations happening with young boys around that. And that's like I'm concerned about young people of all genders, honestly, but I am really concerned about young boys. There's not that even space to do that type of thing or have that type of conversation. And, you know, like, so even if one lad says it, the other lad's going to be like, that's gay. And like, you know, and then you're like, oh, well, that's a whole other kettle of fish. So yeah, I'm concerned about this kind of Jordan Petersonization of young boys that's happening at the moment. Like, I have concerns.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that? Okay. Yeah, Dara, please.
If you want. Yeah, I think something that I think is particularly maybe relevant around the idea of self-compassion, and particularly as it relates to both, you know, eating disorders and body image, and then also maybe around your pride in yourself as a queer person. And I also noticed there was a question in the Q&A there around like whether having an eating disorder or kind of any of this sort of stuff that can come with that, how that impacts on your realization of your identity. And I think for me, there's been a very personal journey around those two things, and which is why I wanted to come in on it. But you know, I had as a teenager, I guess, and into my kind of early 20s, like a lot of really unhealthy habits around eating, around food, and a lot of really unhealthy thoughts around like myself and how I looked and whatever, all that kind of fun stuff. And one of the things that I did to try and really get out of that was that I took the like no negative self-talk to like quite an intense place where I decided that I couldn't really trust the things that I was thinking in my head around how I looked or what people thought of me or whatever it was. And so I just stopped listening to them entirely altogether. And that was one of my coping skills, was to just say, I'm just not engaging with that. I'm not engaging with any thoughts around what I look like, blah, 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 that kind of thing. None of it. And that worked in that way for a bit for me. It helped me in that moment. But one of the ways that it came actually to be quite difficult later was, you know, when I was kind of later on coming into maybe a more full understanding of like myself as a non-binary person, and in particular in the way that I express my gender, and also in the ways that I wanted to be expressing my gender, and particularly around accessing medical transition and like gender affirming healthcare, was that I found it really difficult to break that back down and to allow back in thoughts of like, it actually is okay to think about how you look, and it is okay to want to look different. And I found that like, and that was a really difficult exercise in self-compassion for myself. And that's one of the things I think can be quite specific for people who have experience both with being trans and with having an eating disorder, is around trying to navigate what ways of thinking about this are healthy and safe and okay, and what ones aren't. And even maybe, as I do, possibly overthinking the distinction between those two things too. You know, it's a minefield out there. And so I think definitely for me, like that, my history with all that kind of thing was a huge barrier for me in terms of being able to safely express and explore the ways that I wanted to you know, express myself differently or look different or whatever the case may be. So I suppose I just wanted to highlight that in terms of like, as an exercise in self-compassion and exercise in self-acceptance too, of like, sometimes, you know, it can be a good and a positive thing. And I mentioned earlier around like the success for gender affirming healthcare in terms of treating dysphoria, gender dysphoria, and it was hugely successful for me, you know, in a way that a lot of my ways of trying to cope with eating disorder stuff wasn't. So I think that there can be a really important piece there, as I said earlier, understanding what is the root of those thoughts, and therefore what's going to be the most effective way of treating them. So I just wanted to highlight that too.
I just want to come in, and actually
James,
I have a similar sorry, that just prompted a memory there, Jerry. Thank you very much. That from when I was when I left secondary school, I was I very low self-esteem, absolutely no self-confidence, was a terrified sort of human being pushed out off into the big bad world, didn't know how to engage on, and spent a long time sort of adrift with no real direction until sort of I actually found the perfect jet fuel to start pushing myself forward, which was a diet of self-hate towards my youthful version of like, how could you have let yourself down to this degree? And I used that self-hate very effectively. I managed to achieve a huge amount in my late 20s and early 30s because I was sort of able to look back and be like, you know, you need to prove you're better than this awful version of yourself, this terrible version. And it made that journey when sort of I suppose around the time, even coming up to where the pandemic started, where I actually started being like, I started realizing that actually this anger that I was carrying for myself was actually preventing me from empathizing with other people and preventing me from having compassion for other people. If I was going to be hating myself for much for the failing of having gotten fat, I was also being angry and hating everyone else who was fat. So it was through sort of learning that sort of self-compassion and through kind of sort of unpacking the sort of the ways in which I'd ended up how I was, that I finally was able to sort of find that self-compassion, find that self-love and acceptance, and then also get very angry in probably a much more helpful direction, which is towards the systemic barriers that exist that prevent people from engaging equally.
Okay. Just I want to move on a little bit more to, it's already been mentioned. I know, Caitlin, you'd mentioned this earlier on, and I know, I think Daniel did as well, but accessing healthcare, are there particular issues, I suppose, when it comes to having an eating disorder and accessing healthcare for people from the LGBTQI community? What people's experience of that, thoughts about that? Caitlin, I suppose I'm conscious of your own. You actually said you'd written a play about this.
Yeah, so it wasn't so much within, I suppose, specifically the queer community, but it was about medical fat phobia and fertility, and the barriers that fat people wanting to have kids can face. And yeah, so it was really interesting. I obviously did a lot of research around it. And some of the stories are just like horrendous, and it's I can only imagine as a fat queer person trying to access fertility treatments like that, how that would even be even worse. But I think there's a lot around that, but it's the whole, I mean, medical fat. A friend of mine actually tweeted earlier that they went into their doctors and they were looking for, I think it was actually trans-affirmative healthcare, and the doctor said, well, because of your BMI X, Y, and Z, they hadn't even weighed this person. Like they taken what they were like, I didn't know that you could actually like measure that with your eyes. And I mean, not to speak on this person, but you know, I wouldn't even categorize this person as plus size. And it just shows it's just unbelievable. But yeah.
Anyone else want to come in on that experience or challenge with that experience of again, because of being gay, lesbian, bisexual, whatever? Daniel?
So yeah, I think that a hugely important element is, particularly from a counselling perspective. I'm not a counsellor, so then don't another disclaimer. But I think it's very important, particularly in terms of counselling for, like, I'm talking about individual experience here from counselling in terms of recovery from an eating disorder. It's very important to be exceptional. You have to have a very honest relationship with your counsellor.
Yeah.
And I suppose it also kind of marries into to how you are kind of in terms of accepting yourself and your sexuality. So when I began counselling, you know, I was out as gay, but I was like almost kind of a little bit afraid of telling anyone that I was gay. Do you know what I mean? I didn't know how to bring it up organically. I didn't know, you know, how that would work. So, you know, on a few attempts at with different counselors, I refused to talk about it. I wouldn't bring it up. I wouldn't mention it. And it was, you know, it's a hugely important part of who I am. And also, you know, it definitely did feed into the condition to a certain degree. So I think that definitely is something that is a potential barrier to some individuals, that they may not feel comfortable with speaking with their counsellor about this particular issue. They may, you know, have had poor experience experiences with people of I suppose, a particular demographic of counsellors. I mean, if you've got a counsellor who's much older, there's not necessarily a correct notion, but there's a preconceived notion, oh, an older person isn't going to be as accepting or understanding or whatever like that. So I think from a counselling and psychiatry perspective, it's exceptionally important that the counsellors ensure that it's an entirely open environment, that nothing is said, nothing can be, even subtly, that there's kind of no indication given that this would even be an issue. I think that's really, really important, because it's very hard to recover unless you're very honest with yourself and with your counsellor.
Okay, thanks, Daniel.
James? I wouldn't necessarily speak as regards to the conversation we're having now around body images. My role in LGBT Ireland is working with health and social care professionals to try and help them make their services more inclusive to the needs of older members of the community. But I do think that, particularly as any person within the LGBTI plus community will know, going into a space where you're having to reveal your identity at a point in time when you are feeling particularly vulnerable, or where you feel as if you need someone to be compassionate towards you, can be very scary, because you don't know how that person is going to react. You don't know what assumptions that person is going to make about you or your lifestyle as a result of you revealing that part of who you are. And if you are walking in there as a fat person, you're having the barriers that exist for fat people as well are going to be lumped on top of that. But I think it is just important that health and social care settings start to come out as being inclusive and being really visibly in doing so that people walk in and know at the front door, this is a safe place for me. I can trust that this service is going to meet my needs, and it's not going to be left with this ambiguity, because you do find, particularly when it comes to older members of the LGBTI community who have grown up in an Ireland that was far less inclusive than the one that we exist in today. Those people will be bringing the baggage of the past with them, a fear of exclusion with them, which is potentially going to prevent them from actually engaging with services. I've heard stories of individuals who have declined cancer care as a result of a fear, particularly home care, as a result of a fear that the individual who will be coming to their home to deliver very intimate care wouldn't be inclusive or understanding of their identities, and that could lead to them facing some form of discrimination. And you want to be encouraging people to get care as soon as possible, as quickly as they need it. But with these barriers that exist, people will put off going for it. They'll try and work around it. They'll try and they'll try and find another way to deal with it, because they're afraid of going into somewhere where they're going to be othered or they're going to be discriminated against.
Okay. And Dara, did you want to come in on that, please? Yes.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think in terms of like accessing general healthcare, like, we here, whoever, I feel it is generally widely known that if you walk into a doctor's office or whatever as a fat person, like the first thing that they always will tell you is, have you tried losing weight, or suggest losing weight or whatever, whether or not it is medically relevant. And oftentimes the same is true for trans people. Obviously for fat trans people, but I suppose around your transness, that if you go into a doctor's office, or you need healthcare, or you've broken your arm or whatever, and they ask you what medications you're taking, and if you list HRT as your medication, then it becomes about your transness, again, whether or not it's medically relevant. So there are these dual barriers for people in terms of seeking like general healthcare, which really need to be tackled for the health of us all. But then also in terms of accessing gender affirming healthcare, like, and I think Bella mentioned it earlier, like BMI, which again, if we're going to talk about junk science, let's talk about the BMI. But your BMI is, for many surgeons offering gender affirming surgery, like it is a barrier. Like if you are over whatever a certain BMI, they will not perform surgery on you. As far as I can tell, not for any particularly real medical reason, because there are many surgeons who will do it. But it has very real, like, material impacts, and like even within my social circle of friends, like there's a number of us who have had gender affirming surgeries in the last year or so, or a year and a half maybe. And, I, as somebody who is not experiencing fat phobia, was able to access surgery that was much closer to home. Now, it was still abroad, which is a huge issue, relatively much cheaper, had much like lower travel costs, all of that kind of thing. And then friends of mine who were bigger, who were over this random BMI limit, were traveling much further. They had much higher travel costs. They were staying for much longer, and they were paying much more for surgery too. I think because, again, when you're looking at private healthcare as well, like if you were a surgeon who was offering something that is, again, slightly more niche, that you probably are able to charge more. So there is a real material impact, and in that way, I think it brings in a lot of class issues too, a lot of issues around resources, around access to resources, around, time off for travel, having that kind of employment flexibility, all that sort of thing. So it really does impact on us in very material and of course very health related ways too. So I suppose I just wanted to highlight that as a very distinct intersection of those two issues.
Can I just come in there and just be like the tiniest bit shady? Now, Dara, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. The person who gatekeeps the transgender healthcare person is the same person who runs the obesity task force. Am I right?
Is that true? I did not know that.
Pretty sure that's true.
I think that is true. Yes. Now that I think about it, I think yes.
Go figure.
Interesting.
And let's bear in mind that, the whole concept of BMI came around back in the mid 1950s, put together by a life insurance company as a means of assessing people's relative health. So and it's still, there's got to be a better way to do that. Anything else on the healthcare side that people feel that has been unique or that they've experienced or that they know of?
I think for me, just as a woman trying to, I'm also on hormones. Lots of people are on hormones. You can be cis, you can be trans. I take progesterone. I do that for a myriad of reasons, none of which are conception. I think being bi and being fat are both seen as and not to speak on your own experience, Dara, but maybe non-binary as well. It's seen as a liminal space that you should not be occupying for too long. Surely you're bi on your way to something else and you're fat on your way to slim and you're non-binary on your way to binary, and you're just that complicates every conversation you have with a doctor. Now I'm very lucky, I now live in Brussels where they have excellent healthcare, so I'm very excited to go to the doctor for €6. I'm really, really excited. What I'm really excited to avoid is going to the doctor and being just straight up insulted with medical information that's wrong, that I know more about than they do, and paying €80 for the pleasure. That's what I'm just really not to be mean to people who still live in Ireland, but Brussels is really good. So I remember going to the doctor and her saying, I went for literally, I think it might've been a throat infection, ear infection, something like that. And she sat me down and she was just can we talk now? Are you aware that you're overweight? First of all, I'm sorry, there's just not a person living in a larger body who isn't painfully aware of it.
Yes.
And let's say that is awful for fat people all of the time, but I would say that's awful for anybody of any size, because you don't know who has an eating disorder. You don't know who comes in, sees that chart, that big BMI chart, and then is thinking, sees the scales and is triggered by that. You don't know, it is literally, it's bad for everybody. And I said, I'm aware, because I wear my own clothes and I can see myself. I'm aware. And she's like, right now, and would you think about addressing this for your health? And I was like, oh, is there something wrong with my health? Or are you just in my blood pressure? Is there something wrong with it? Yeah. Should we do maybe cholesterol, or is there other things we need to do? She's like, no, just from your health. And I was like, well, again, is there anything wrong with my health? She was like, no, your blood pressure was fine. And I was like, okay, it's actually very bad for my mental health to actively think about restricting my food. That's something that's, for me, very destructive. And she's like, well, I'm not talking about your mental health. I'm talking about your physical health. And I was like, they are linked. Are
connected.
They are so linked. And the next time I went back to that surgery, I said to the receptionist, I said, can I just not see the person I saw last time? And she was like, no problem. She knew.
Yeah. Guys, we seem to be getting a number of questions coming in. I'm just getting a message about that. Barry, do you want to come in with some of those? So we've got about 15 minutes left. If we want to try and address some of those questions.
Yeah, so there's one here, I think, piggybacking off a comment from Bella made there. So the question is, I think it was Bella who mentioned the masculization of women and woman aligned people with their fatness, and also the intersection of fat phobia and misogyny combined with homophobia, essentially erasing people. How do we best dismantle this warped glorification of the male gaze and the responsibility forced on femme-presenting people to pay that any heed in a patriarchal society?
Well,
okay, Bella.
It's a big question. Yes. I think what we have to stop thinking of is people in relation to men, as in to maleness. So the thing is, I've noticed that men, and I will speak binarily for a moment, have an access to queerness is quite easy. We've decided that people are queer icons who are men who've never come out as LGBT. It's just like, oh, they wore eyeliner once. And everyone's like, oh my God, an icon. And a woman can like literally be married to another woman. And they'll be like, I don't know, I think she might be straight. You know, it's like, and this is what it's doing, is centralizing men. It's saying that bi women can only be attracted to men, bi men can only be attracted to men, bi men are gay, bi women are straight, therefore everyone is at the disposal of men. And sometimes when you see like the kind of issues in the community at the moment, where there's a very, very small minority of some queer people who are transphobic and biphobic, and that often goes together, is that they're saying that like, you cannot be in that space if you have anything to do with maleness, as if that is some sort of magic force or something. Like if we're talking about bodies, the bodies are not weapons, bodies are body parts. And there's nothing inherently dangerous about a particular body. What's dangerous is male entitlement. That's dangerous. Trans women do not have that, therefore they are not a danger. You know, we have to think about it that way. And I think if we just decenter male desire from the entire conversation, then we'll get somewhere. But it's, again, easier said than done.
Okay. Anyone else wants to comment on that, or do you want to move? If we have other questions, Barry?
Dara picked up on the earlier one, actually. So kind of just a comment from myself, really. Something that I felt came across from everyone. There's a lot sometimes that's put on you guys around being lectured at or being preached at, and it's kind of, you should be this, that, and the other. But even so, even that said, I think there's a sense of hope here today. And like, we're still short in terms of reaching Martin Luther King's vision of people being judged on the content of their character and not other kind of personal attributes. So maybe what gives you a sense of hope around maybe some of the issues we've talked about today?
Okay, guys, want to come in on that?
I suppose it's being part of discussions like this, and actually meeting people who are like-minded, and going, oh, I'm not, I don't know, I'm not of like, you know, out of it thinking that this could be a possibility. There are people who think like this and align themselves, and yeah, that kind of gives me hope. Yeah, not a lot does, but good conversations and like-minded people.
I think just on that point, it's just so important. Obviously, you know, a lot of the conversation we've been having so far today has been kind of focusing on, you know, it's quite a heavy topic. It always will be. I think it's so important to reinforce that, you know, and it's something that I've definitely realized myself personally in the last year, is that it's so important to have lightness around queerness, and it's so important to be like, you know what, like, this is actually, I think it's an absolutely beautiful thing. Like, I think it's probably my favorite aspect about myself, and it's wonderful to be able to say that, because when you're growing up, you're like, oh, I'll never like this, I'll never accept this, but you're like, actually, this is wonderful. So it's important to kind of have that lightness around queerness, and also important to realize that, you know, obviously there is internal discrimination within the community, and that's very poor, but there's also a huge amount of support within the community. I think what's very life-saving for queer people, and even for myself, is having other queer friends, you know, having people that understand you, having people that, you know, love you without any caveats, that, you know, no prejudgments, no anything like that, I think is exceptionally important. And again, that lightness, and that it's very important for that to come through in the media as well. I think that a lot of the representations of queerness and people within the community is like, it's always, you know, it's always the dark storyline, it's always this character, and, you know, they go through hell trying to figure out who they are. But, you know, then you have other shows like, again, it's a very recent example is Heartstopper, for example, where, like, it was, you know, there was still that internal struggle, but it was just a bit more light, and it was a bit more like, actually, hang on, maybe this isn't the worst thing in the world. So I think it's really important, again, to kind of reinforce that lightness to the media and to ourselves, and the way we speak about ourselves and those within the community as well.
James, what gives you hope?
So I actually just want to hear more or less what Daniel said there about kind of his queerness being is favorite thing about it. It is my favorite thing about me as well, and it took me a long time to realize that. And it was only sort of over the last kind of couple of over the last sort of while, kind of looking around at sort of my straight cis friends, I was like, God, you guys are so lucky to have me in your life to show you what sparkle actually looks like, and to give you a window into this amazing community that we're all part of, because it definitely has its flaws. But it's being on this call today with the people who've been speaking, and the sort of levity and lightness and laughter that comes along with a very heavy topic, it really does kind of just give you hope that sort of we're a very resilient bunch, and that we've got great sense of humor. And I wouldn't trade this part of who I am for anything in the world. If I could be told you can go back to being 5 years old and you can be a straight sporty guy who will grow up in that, I would say no thank you very much. I'd much rather be having walked in Pride this weekend and being who I am. So I think that gives me hope, and everyone else on the call, everyone's been saying, also gives me great hope.
James, that is, thank you. That is wonderful. Genuinely, just that's so affirming, I think, for so many people, just for that message to come across. Yeah. Dara, yeah.
I was also hoping to piggyback off Daniel's point there around like the lightness and the joy and that kind of thing, and something that and I think even actually something that Bella mentioned earlier around like the way we talk about food and exercise, all that kind of stuff, like it's sucking the joy out of it for us, and it's becoming all around whatever, like calories or weight loss or weight gain or that kind of stuff, and instead of being about like movement for fun and for joy, and food for fun and for joy. And I think that equally goes with transness and with like trans experiences. And I think, what has given me wonderful joy myself actually, in recent years, has been hearing more and more people talk almost less about gender dysphoria and more about gender euphoria as the like exact opposite of that. And in terms of like trying to center that, like, actually, exactly maybe to James' point, like it's not all doom and gloom being trans, and like some of it's really hard, and like there are a lot of systemic things that are really, really difficult, but like it also can be a wonderfully life affirming, joyful, like exploratory, beautiful time in anybody's life, to be able to come into a more full understanding of yourself, to express yourself more fully, whether that is around your gender identity, whether it's around like all that kind of self-acceptance, that kind of self-love piece, which invites other people into like a better understanding of you and a better relationship with you. And something that has been really earth moving for me in the last few years along like my own personal journey is around that piece. Is around like, you're not asking too much by asking people to respect your name or your pronouns or whatever it might be. You're not asking for too much. You actually are inviting people into a better relationship with you. And I think that goes for all of us in terms of how we center ourselves and how we center the joy of our lives in whatever respect. And I just that has been really really fundamental for me, I think, in the last few years, and gives me a lot of hope for all of our communities.
Okay, Bella.
Well, I think, as everyone has said, like having this conversation gives me a huge amount of hope, because I do think we're very new to having a conversation about fatness and fat phobia. And I know, like, ultimately, if we get rid of fat phobia, it won't get rid of all eating disorders, but it will certainly help. I really do think it will help. And obviously still people will still suffer, but it will definitely not be the problem it is now, one of the mental health issue with some of the highest mortality, and that's the reality of it. And what gives me hope is the youth. I mean, I work with young people and they're just fabulous. I mean, they get it. They're so clued in. They're so amazing. And I do think they're the future if we give them all the resources they need and deserve, but they're not going to be if they're not here. And that's really, really important. We have to make sure that, the stage is set for them to take over. And like, there is lots of movement happening, particularly in Ireland. There's a new publication called Fat Era, which is supported by the Arts Council around fatness. But I think people need to understand that, like, I just experience far more discrimination as rocking a larger bod than I do being queer. Like, and people don't understand that. If I sent a tweet, I guarantee if I sent a tweet and said someone yelled you dyke at me, and if I sent a tweet saying that, I get loads of engagement. I've said, so if someone called me fat on the street, no engagement. Like, people still don't care. And the level of street harassment fat people get is astronomical. Like, I get far more just from living in the body I do than being queer. And but people don't care. And I think the more we have conversations, the more we have straight-sized people who are our allies using their privilege to bring this up as a conversation, the better, and recommending things like podcasts like Maintenance Phase and things like that. You know, if that comes from a straight-sized person, actually will go further than if it comes from me. It seems self-serving. So yeah, there's a lot to be hopeful about, but there's a lot to do.
And maybe just a comment I want to make on, I'm just been very conscious as we've been having this conversation this afternoon that there's probably a group of people who are not represented at the moment, which is here in this conversation. I'm not saying it's anyone's fault, but just a comment is people of color. Because we know that people of color have eating disorders. We know that people of color are part of the LGBTIQ plus group as well. And so I would sincerely hope that in the future, next time we've a conversation maybe around this topic or whatever, that that group will be represented also, because I'd like to hear their voice. I think they must have something to say themselves that is unique for them. And again, just a sense of isolation that some of you talked about earlier on must be very, very strong at times within that community. So maybe if there's opportunity for us to reach out into that community as well, that we should make efforts to do so. Okay, just before we finish up then, I just want to say, you know, we're coming to the end of our time. Thanks for to everyone. You know, it's been lovely to meet you all. I've enjoyed listening to you, hearing you, engaging with you, and thank you very, very much for giving up your time today for this. Also, I want to thank the people from Bodywise, and particularly those working behind the scenes here, who have done so much to bring this together over this past week. Guys, thank you very, very much. And if for people who are listening on this recording or on the live transcription, if you've been particularly affected by any of the issues that have been brought up today, you can contact the support services of Bodywise at any time. The address is alex@bodywise.ie. That's ALEX at Bodywise, BODYWHYS.ie. So take care.